Test 1 2 3. Test 1, 2, 3. All right, as we hit the 5 minute mark ahead of time, I'm just going to make sure everything's all in order. I'm looking at about a 30, 35, 40 minute presentation. And if people could just, if someone could type and make sure that the audio is coming through correctly, if there's not too much feedback in the chat bar, that would be really helpful. Right, I increased the volume on the mic. Let me know if it works. Awesome. There's a lot of latency in my ear, so it's really weird. I say something and then I hear it back like 10 seconds later. That'll take some getting used to. So ahead of time, I'm going to get some basic pleasantries out of the way. I have to extend a huge shout out to Daniel Huffman. They just did a fantastic job putting this all together. Um, they've been super helpful, especially I had to deal with a lot of technical problems ahead of time, and they just were beyond understanding and generous with their time and attention. So huge credit to that. Make sure you check out the other lectures if you can. And overall, I think this has just been a fantastic experiment in the mapping community. And I know after this, I'm going to be streaming more on other topics if I can, because this has really opened my eyes to kind of the power that streaming can be as an educational tool, not just watching speedruns on Fortnite. The topic today, and it's still technically not two yet, so I'm not hustling, but the topic today is going to be focusing on Mapbox and ArcGIS Online. We're going to kind of go through a few quick demos, both through the web and locally. It's going to be very visually focused, and I'm going to be focusing on the practical side of things and kind of how to do a step by step process because I myself am not a web developer and I couldn't tell you a lot of the back end behind these processes, but I think hopefully it'll be easy for people who don't have a detailed background in code or development to get a lot from this tutorial and from these techniques. I forgot to say this earlier, but huge thanks to my coworker Greg Fisk who helped me test streaming yesterday, and also just for being a fantastic help and resource in general. I was recently hired at the Woods Hole Research Center, and I think actually some of my coworkers from WHRC are watching this. But it's a fantastic institute. If you get the time, you should for sure check it out. because they've enabled me to carry on with cartography and have the time to branch out and do activities like this. All right, so we are starting. I've switched over to a live desktop display. All right, looks good. Okay, this is my presentation for the How to Do Map Stuff webinar, hosted obviously by Daniel Huffman. This is how to use Mapbox in ArcGIS Online and a few other tricks and tips along the way. So we're going to break things down into a few mini sections, kind of aiming for about 30-40 minutes, as I said. We're going to start with what is Mapbox, what is ArcGIS, then move forward into how you can kind of expand the default utility of Mapbox Studio by adding custom rosters, then how you can combine Mapbox and ArcGIS Pro on a desktop. And then finally, we're going to end with how you can use Mapbox in ArcGIS Online. And that is everything from web maps to, incorporating it into operations, dashboards, or story maps, which I'm very excited about. And this whole thing is not going to be a slideshow. This is literally the last slide. But just for people who don't know, ArcGIS and Mapbox are kind of two major GIS entities. They're both different geospatial platforms, but in a practical sense, ArcGIS is kind of it's a little bit older. It's more established, and it caters a lot to both the desktop and the web-based GIS community. While Mapbox is very much web-based, it caters a lot towards developers, especially. Not that ArcGIS doesn't, but Mapbox has a stronger focus on that specific demographic. And they both work in roughly similar ways in an aesthetic sense. And what I've noticed with working extensively with both is that ArcGIS tends to be, um, I, I want to find the right way to phrase this, but it's a little bit more um, practically focused. It's focused on you know basic tools that like local government will use or a charity will use, and because it's more established, it's a little bit more set in its visual ways, and obviously that has been changing a lot. Um, you know, I know he's watching this, but John Nelson especially is one of kind of a crack team of Esri cartographers that has been helping really expand the potential portfolio that you can do with Esri. Um, but I've had to work with both a lot, and they tend to operate in different spheres a lot of the time. There's not a lot of direct overlap between the two, and maybe I'm just not looking in the right places. But I tend to see Mapbox people working in Mapbox, Esri people work in ArcGIS, or they use something like QGIS. But there's not a lot of crossing the streams. So all these workflows today are going to be about what you can do with a bit of both, how you can incorporate them both into the same workflow and kind of extend each a bit beyond than what you can do if you stay inside that community for the entire workflow. So now that that part is over with, I'm going to talk about at least the first thing that I noticed I could do with Mapbox, which is adding custom rosters. Now, Mapbox Studio, if we go over to it, Mapbox Studio lets you change on the fly geospatial data tile sets in kind of this web interface, which is really powerful because Mapbox has some fantastic it has some fantastic default data sets that you can use that just look excellent, like the satellite imagery, the hillshade, and to real quickly answer, I think, Deb Whitcomb's question. I just started the stream a bit early because of some technical requirements, but it started right at 2. So you haven't missed anything. But getting back to my point, Mapbox has these default data sets that are fantastic, but you run into problems sometimes where kind of the default data doesn't work perfectly for you. I work a lot with maps set in Western Alaska, and the default data for Western Alaska in Mapbox, the default imagery has a lot of clouds in it. You can see right here. Especially as you zoom in too, there can be big differences between imagery quality. For example, in part of East Africa, the highest resolution default imagery is black and white. And you can see here in Alaska, it's not particularly appealing. So what I first wanted to do with Mapbox is I wanted to get my own imagery into Mapbox that was better suited for that particular area. And I personally use Google Earth Engine, and with a workflow that Greg Fisk introduced me to, I export cloud-free Sentinel mosaics, which just look gorgeous, but I couldn't get them into Mapbox. So I worked out that you can add custom 8-bit rosters into Mapbox, and this is really, really helpful if you have custom imagery. So if I zoom to one that I've already put in, and then I'll show you how to do this yourself. This is Sentinel imagery that I pulled into Mapbox. And because Google Earth Engine exports rasters as georeferenced data already, you can drop them right in. You do need to change the raster bit depth though, which is something I'll get into later. But it's fantastic. So I'm going to talk about how you actually get a raster from something like Google Earth Engine into Mapbox. And so I'm going to pull up my local pro demo, and I've already loaded this up with the data set I want to add. And this is a mosaic of the Rwenzori Mountains in Uganda and part of the DRC. And it's fantastic imagery. And actually, if you look at the Mapbox imagery of the same area, it's not great. There's a lot more cloud cover, but this, it's very clear. It's very high detail. So when Google Earth Engine exports rasters, it provides them natively as a 64-bit raster. And Mapbox can only handle an 8-bit raster. So you have to change it. Mapbox will not allow you to upload anything else. So you can do this really easily in Pro by going to the Export Raster button, and you pull up this little toolbar here, which lets you change the pixel type of your raster. And this can help you get past it. So I need to be very clear, there's some certain settings you need to click or else it won't turn out right. You need to use render and force RGB. This basically, and people can correct me on this, this converts it essentially into just a picture, just an RGB image. And because you're not doing any analysis with the actual raster itself, that's not important. You're just trying to get, the colors. So you use a renderer, which forces it to use the image that's being displayed as, and you force it as an RGB raster. In my experience, if you don't click this button, it'll show up as just black. So you do this, make sure you have it set up as 8-bit signed, and you export it. And then if all goes well, yep. Now, if we go to our properties, it's an 8-bit raster, and this will work inside Mapbox. So let's make sure we have the right file location, and let's upload it. You can see probably that I've been screwing with Mapbox for a while, and it's been piling up. So I'm just going to make sure this is the right file. Mosaic 2. Yep. And because this is pretty small, it should upload relatively quickly. And what Mapbox is doing right now is it's converting the raster into a format that it can dynamically scale inside of Mapbox Studio, which is really helpful when you're operating a different. Because Mapbox Studio is by default interactive, you want to be able to zoom in and out and get those different scales and get it to kind of smoothly transition. So it hopefully this will move pretty quickly. And if there's problems here, I've already uploaded data so you can see what it looks like. Fantastic, and it's processing. This can take a while. You want to aim for a roster ideally around 100 megabytes, but Mapbox can handle very, very large rosters. It's just you can run into situations, and this has happened to me, where you upload a very large roster and it goes all the way to the end of the bar, and then it errors out at like 2 a.m. and you don't see it until the next morning. Right, so it succeeded. So let's see if we can RW. All right, there is our roster. And because it's already georeferenced, and keep in mind, you can do this with any 8-bit roster, you just have to georeference it at some point. And there we go. There's our new mosaic. And if we turn it off, you can see the difference between the two. And it's a bit higher resolution. And yeah, this is what I mentioned earlier. Some of the imagery for Africa is black and white, which obviously isn't very good if you're working for a map without that aesthetic. So now we're going to move on to the next part of kind of what custom rosters can accomplish, which is georeferencing stuff besides imagery, because you can georeference any roster. And because a roster is technically just a picture, you can do that with, say an antique map, right? So I did this already. I georeferenced a global geologic map, and I just pulled off a map from the excellent, I think, David Rumsey Map Center. I can't remember the name of it off my top of my head, but yeah, David Rumsey Historical Map Collection. So this is a fantastic resource to use if you don't know about it, that has a huge gallery of antique maps at very high resolution, and I just downloaded one. This is a geologic map from the 80s, and I georeferenced it in Pro, exported it as an unsigned 8-bit roster, and then it drops right into Mapbox beautifully. And because it's Mapbox, you can go 3D, right? And you can put, other Mapbox layers on top of it. And it just works out fantastically. Um, and I've done this with some antique hillshade maps. I posted a map a few weeks ago on Twitter where I did this with Crater National Park, I think, Crater Lake in, I think, Oregon or Washington. I'm not from there, so if you are from there, I'm really, really sorry. Um, yeah. And I've done this also with some of my own hillshades that I georeferenced. So I did this hillshade of Tuscany for a client, and I just dropped it right into Mapbox, and it works. And this is a great way to get around the default hillshade in Mapbox is really, really good, but it's a very, sleek, modern look. And sometimes you don't want that. What I want to emphasize over and over and over again, it was in Oregon. What I want to emphasize over and over again is that it's not that Mapbox, ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Online are necessarily bad, for certain tasks. It's that you're almost always going to run eventually into a use case where you want something that the default software package cannot easily provide. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can't have something for everything all the time. It's impossible. Just like you can't have a map that covers everything, you can't have a software that does everything. And tools that let you upload your own data, like Mapbox provides, is a great way to get around that. So moving on to the next part of this little webinar is how you can take all of this and dump it back into Pro. I've been showing you how to kind of work inside Mapbox through Pro. Now I'm going to do the opposite real quickly. And, oh, no, actually I need to show you something cool before I do that. So one step I extended this to was hillshades in Blender, right? So Daniel Huffman obviously has talked a lot about why Blender is great for making hillshades. And my first thought once I started importing rosters into Mapbox was I want to add a Blender hillshade into Mapbox. And so I built a hillshade in Blender, I georeferenced it, and then I uploaded it into Mapbox. And I blended it in, and you get just these gorgeous, gorgeous shadows that are just fantastic, right? But there's a few things there's a few things you have to do before you can blend it. All my other examples so far are just straight, total opacity dropped in. But in order to blend a hillshade, you have to make a few adjustments. So this is the hillshade totally unblended natively, right? And if you just try and drop the opacity, it doesn't really work very well. For the same reason that just dropping the opacity of a roster in ArcGIS Pro doesn't work very well, because the colors are all kind of muddled. And because Mapbox Studio only lets you adjust, the opacity, it doesn't even let you adjust the gradient of colors. You have to play with things a little bit differently. So what I did is if you drop the opacity and then you really supercharge the contrast, what you end up with is very, very stark shadows and very stark highlights. So when you drop the opacity, they show up a bit better with the underlying terrain. And then you also need to adjust the underlying layer to compensate. So I tend to tweak the brightness a little bit. I tend to up the contrast to kind of counteract that. Although obviously it would need to be tweaked here. And you get just fantastic 3D shadows that you cannot get with, any default hillshade. And I've been playing with this a lot. I put it into a story map I did of the Philippines that I thought turned out really, really well. I'm working on another story map that uses this. So this is, I think, kind of a great metaphor for modern GIS, where I'm taking a raster DEM, dropping it into Pro, exporting it into Blender, making it a hillshade in Blender, dropping it back into Pro, georeferencing it, exporting it out as an 8-bit, uploading it into Mapbox, and then I'm putting it into Esri again for use in a story map. So you're just kind of sticking your finger in basically every pie along the way. It feels a little bit heretical, but I think it's worth it. So when I want to take all this cool stuff I've made in Mapbox, right, and I want to say drop it back into Pro, it's surprisingly easy, and I didn't think it would be easy when I started to experiment with it, because unfortunately the documentation around Mapbox and ArcGIS integration is a little bit scattered. But if you go to publish, right, and then you share it, you get these options right here. And most of the time, I think people go for this one because this lets you obviously embed it into a website. But what you want to do if you're uploading it into Pro specifically is you want to use the WMTS button. You want to copy this URL, go back into Pro, right? Then you want to add a connection. And this was originally designed for ArcMap, but it works in Pro, thankfully. And all right, nothing seems to happen, right? But if we go to our catalog pane and then our servers button, it's right there. And it's pulling the tiles from Mapbox, from the internet, into ArcGIS Pro. And now we have access to our entire Mapbox style inside Pro. And I use this a couple times. I use this especially for imagery because the Esri default imagery on a global scale, it doesn't pop as well as the Mapbox imagery. It's really good on small scales, especially for the Arctic. But on a global scale, I want something that's a bit more impactful. And Mapbox imagery is just gorgeous. And you'll notice some errors like this. This can happen because of buffering, but it normally goes away if you just refresh it. Yeah, this works in ArcMap, and it also does the entire globe. Now, because Mapbox exists only inside of WebMercator, it will force things to WebMercator, which is a problem. It especially means that you can't georeference maps of very northern latitudes on a large scale because they're distorted. So that is definitely a known limitation. But I know at least that the people at Mapbox are looking at different projections and how to work their way around that. And the coolest thing is you can do this with a local scene in Pro. Now you can't do 3D in ArcGIS Online with Mapbox. I've tried and my dreams have been crushed. But if anybody else can figure that out, I'd owe you forever. But you can do it in Pro. So I've already imported it into Pro, right? And now, if we tilt it, and because this is Pro, right? And Mapbox doesn't have 3D terrain. Mapbox is 3D, but it doesn't have 3D terrain. But Pro does. So if we increase that vertical exaggeration, we get real 3D terrain with our Mapbox colors. And this is really, really useful. You know, if you want to take your cool Mapbox style, you want to make a map with it in Pro, you can do that. And you can even go further than Mapbox Studio and have real 3D in it, which I love making maps in 3D. I find that my ability to make maps in 3D has been limited kind of by where all the different softwares are at the moment. But especially with the latest Pro update, 3D has been vastly improved, and I think it just looks fantastic. Um, and then because this is still ArcGIS, right, you can use ArcGIS data. So I pulled in some Rwandan roads from Living Atlas, and it'll just naturally drop in seamlessly. So on Chamb Key 1's question, I don't know. I've never run into issues with Mapbox in that sense, so I'd be the wrong person to ask. I really haven't done anything where I've been burning through a lot of resources anyways. These have all kind of been fun demos, but if you try and you figure it out an answer, please let me know because that would make a difference for sure in some use cases. So this is Living Atlas data of Rwanda, and you can drape it right on top of your Mapbox style, and boom. And because it's inside Pro, it just works fine with the 3D terrain. Now you will notice there's a lot of popping in. That's because it's pulling all these different layers and it's trying all these different tiles and it's trying to kind of keep up. But like I said, normally if you kind of give it a bit of time and you refresh it, it'll sort itself out. And especially on the web, if you refresh your cache, that helps a lot too. Unfortunately, I don't have an exact solution, but it's never been a terrible problem for me personally. All right, so this is Pro. This is everything that I at least have figured out how to do with Mapbox and Pro. But when we take it to the other end of the Esri suite, ArcGIS Online, that's where I think things get really interesting. So we're going to exit out of Pro, and we are going to move to ArcGIS Online. And I'm just going to use my own account. And we're going to be doing fundamentally the same thing. We're going to be dropping Mapbox into ArcGIS Online as kind of roster tiles. So I have a few tests. I have some examples that I have preloaded, but I also want to do one live, ideally. All right, so this is, yeah, all right, preload's fine. So we're going to try and do this live, and I'm going to see if it works. So we have our webinar demo, we have our Mapbox style. Now we want to drop it into a web map, right? So we're going to go back to the same page, but we're going to go to ArcGIS Online. And it's fantastic that Mapbox provides this service. So kudos on that, because that really enabled everything. So you'll see the instructions in ArcGIS Online. Click add layer from web, a tile layer, and paste in the URL. So we're going to copy our URL, add layer from web, tile layer, enter, demo, test. Boom, there we go. And now our Mapbox style is inside of ArcGIS Online. And the same rule applies. We can drop in data from Living Atlas freely on top of this. This is a great way to kind of maximize what Mapbox is really good for, with what Esri is really good for. So we would just Esri World Transportation, and there are Esri layers. I think Mapbox has fantastic imagery. I think Mapbox has fantastic terrain, and in general, Mapbox is very customizable, and it's fantastic for web development. But that I'm not going to try and say that word. I'm very sleep deprived. How easily customized it is also means that it can be a bit less user friendly if you're not very comfortable with web technology. And what I like about this is this lets you, you can build a really in-depth Mapbox style, and then you can drop it right into ArcGIS Online and move forward, if you're an Esri user. And here we have Esri Living Atlas with Mapbox imagery in ArcGIS Online. But let's take it a step further now. Let's make a story map. So I'm going to exit out of this. And I'm going to show an example of a quick story map I'm going to build on the fly. And then I'm going to show one that I've already made to kind of, it's a work in progress. And I'm spoiling it a bit myself, but I figured, it's worth it. So let's do webinar demo. And this is the new Esri story map builder. Just for anyone who isn't well versed in what's going on with Esri. So we're going to add in our map. Now remember, this is a web map. It's not anything different from any other web map. So you can do everything you would with another web map with this, because technically the Mapbox imagery is just, it's a raster layer, right? So this is one I made earlier, focused on Ethiopia, and it's a web map, right? And you can pan around in it. You can, add different uses. And you can do this inside a web app builder. I've been trying a lot with the new experience builder. And if we go back to one I've already made, we have our web map, and it's loading. But then we can also use this to tell a bit of a story. So because it's a web map, we can pan around to different locations and let the really cool style speak for itself. And you might notice these shadows. These are what I call Walker shadows. These are this was an idea pioneered by Johnny Walker. I'm sure you probably saw his webinar, but me and Greg, we just absolutely fell in love with it, and I've been slapping these things in every Mapbox style I'm working on. But you'll notice you get this dynamic panning. And we have Mapbox roads, Mapbox labels. Now, one thing I didn't notice is that Mapbox labels, they will rotate in Mapbox, but if you rotate the web map in Esri, they will not rotate, which can lead for some weird results. So normally, if I'm planning on changing the orientation of the map, I will leave alt text off in Mapbox and do that in a web map on the web map side. But here I wasn't going to change the orientation, so it didn't matter much. And you'll notice these little slash marks. I think that's because of the places data set that Mapbox uses. I'm guessing that these are OSM labels and that these are Amharic labels, and that Mapbox, I've run into some issues with Mapbox and some lesser known writing systems, and I think that might be the cause. But That's kind of a separate issue. Ibrahim, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, thank you. Thank you for that. So I am going to, I guess, wrap up by showing an example of a quick web map that I built earlier that uses this. Let's see if it'll load fine. Yep. So this is a little web map I did with the help of David Garcia. You might know him as Map Baker Dave, and it's just a little map showcasing kind of this technique for some terrain in the Philippines. But so I have a web map. On that web map, I have a Mapbox style that I built with a Blender hillshade, Mapbox imagery, and Mapbox labels. And then I put it inside of a story map, and it dynamically moves to different locations. And I kind of let the Mapbox, because Mapbox lets you achieve a really different look from a default Esri web map, and it can be really effective to kind of giving your overall story map a different flavor. Especially, I think the Blender hillshade here did a fantastic job of making the terrain look really punchy and tropical compared to what I could do default in Esri. And so I'm pairing it up with multiple techniques. You know, I have a photo here, free use, commons, obviously. I'm using a Blender hillshade. I'm using Esri base map. I'm using it inside of an Esri story map. And I'm using, you know, Photoshop and some Esri data to make a little extent map here. And I'm putting them all together to tell a cohesive story, right? And that's the real power of GIS. Mapbox is really, really great. Esri, ArcGIS Online is really, really great. But by putting them together, you can kind of get something that uses aspects of both to tell the best story for the landscape, because that always should be the focus of any map. And that should be everything. So this is all very much a work in progress. I've been experimenting a lot with this. This is, I think, as far as I've gotten so far. You could definitely extend things a bit farther with code. I've been working on some scrolly telling maps, some Mapbox scrolly telling maps that use kind of a combination of both, but those aren't really in a place where I'm comfortable demoing them yet. But I think there's a lot of potential here, and especially going forward, I'm really excited to see how Mapbox and Esri both push the collective web envelope, because as web development advances as a field, you're going to see more examples of this, of kind of different software blending together. So I'm checking the comments if there's any questions. Oh, Rudo, that's a great question. So I've tried that, and ArcGIS Online scenes operates kind of on a very restrictive wavelength, and I've had a lot of problems getting Mapbox styles into ArcGIS Online 3D. I don't know if that's changed, but last time I tried, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it at all. I think it's because they use different tiling schemes. And because ArcGIS Online exclusively uses a global scene, while Pro uses a local scene when it's loading Mapbox. So I think it only works for local scenes. Peter, Carl, were you able to repeat the workflow from DEM back into Studio? Is that the Blender hillshade? Because I can do that real quickly. I'm not going to render anything because you all have lives, but sure. So you have a DEM, right? And you make a hillshade in Blender, and you have that just sitting as an image, right? That's normally the end result of kind of the Huffman workflow. So what you need to do is you need to take that DEM and you need to drop it. You need to take that hillshade and you need to drop it in to ArcGIS Pro, and you need to georeference it. So I'm just dropping in a hillshade. You need to drop it into Pro, you need to georeference it, and then you need to export it as an 8-bit unsigned raster. And that's pretty easy because it normally defaults to that. That doesn't look right. But this is a hillside I just dropped in, and it defaulted to an 8-bit unsigned raster. So you georeference that. It's just being a pain right now. You export it out, and then you upload it into Mapbox. And if you georeference it well, it'll just drop in perfectly. That's it. So the Blender part is just secondary. It doesn't really matter much how you got the image. You can do it with a Blender hillshade, with a regular hillshade, with a 1700s map of Switzerland, which I've done, and it looks really cool. The important part is that it's georeferenced as an unsigned 8-bit raster, and then you upload it. I can't speak. You upload it into Mapbox, and Mapbox takes care of it for you. Ibrahim. Yeah, so Cesium.js, I looked a little bit into 3D web mapping a while ago, and Cesium was one of the solutions I looked at. Unfortunately, I'm not a great JavaScript coder. D3 makes me cry, and Cesium isn't much different. But yeah, that's definitely possible. I know there's some custom solutions to 3D Mapbox that have been developed with stuff like that, but they're kind of at this point they're kind of individual web demos, and I can't really go into much detail about how they operate. Only that I know that they exist, but they're not officially supported by either Mapbox or ArcGIS Pro. All right. Unless there's anything else, that should be everything. Yeah. Again, thanks to Daniel Huffman. Thanks to Greg Fisk, Johnny Walker. I could go on listing names for forever, but thank you everyone for giving me this platform. I hope this expanded your tool set a little bit, and please keep it. This should be saved. Lynn, this should be saved. And I'm recording locally just in case. So two things would have to go wrong. But yeah, thank you everyone for paying attention. And I'm sure I will jump ship with the rest of you to go look at some other presentations.